All right, so one of the things that we note right at the beginning here of this lesson is part of what can make this subject so confusing is the fact that our English Bibles, as the Old Testament is arranged, it's not arranged in chronological order. Uh, Perhaps it is when we start with the book of Genesis. Certainly seems to be when we get to the book of Malachi. But in between, the books are not in a full chronological order. You're going to have things happening, for example, in Ezra that come well after, for example, the Psalms. And so we need to be aware of that when we come into our Bibles and begin to study, that we're not reading this like we would read a novel that is presented in chronological order. Sometimes there is some back and forth. And remember, we're not reading just one book. We're reading a collection, the Old Testament, of 39 books. And so there is some movement along a timeline, along the chronological order here. So you're looking at Ezra chapter 1. We have mentioned you have three campaigns of the Babylonians against Jerusalem. And this is what is going to end 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. You've got the first foray of Babylon against Judah and Jerusalem, and that's probably when Daniel's taken captive in 606 BC. You've got a second time around 597 BC, and most likely that's going to be when Ezekiel is taken captive. And then you've got this third campaign of Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon against Judah and Jerusalem in 586 BC that sees the temple destroyed and sees nearly all of the people taken captive. So they're taken captive, taken into Babylonian captivity. And how long are they going to be in Babylonian captivity? 70 years, that's right. And we read this in the book of Daniel a couple of weeks ago. You've got Nebuchadnezzar serving as king, and then eventually, who does the book of Daniel, what Babylonian king does it focus on next? Belshazzar, right? And this is Daniel chapter 5. And really, the chapter that is devoted to Belshazzar, you have the handwriting on the wall, and what happens at the end of that chapter? He dies. What falls with him? The Babylonian kingdom. And who receives their kingdom? The Medes and the Persians, right? And this fits with Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 2. Remember Nebuchadnezzar's dream and the four succeeding world empires? You started with Babylon, and in Daniel 5, Babylon has now given way to the Medes and the Persians. And that is what you have happening in 2nd Chronicles 36, the end of 2nd Chronicles, and the beginning of Ezra chapter 1, which are going to present the same information. Look with me here at Ezra 1 and verse 1. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah. Now, what's that? The 70 years. That's the 70 years, right. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing, saying, "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. Every survivor, at whatever place he may live, let the men of that place support him with silver and gold and goods and cattle, together with a freewill offering for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem." And so here is the decree. If you are a Jew, you are now free to do what? Yeah, you're free to go home. And this would coincide approximately with those 70 years being up. You've been in captivity. Ostensibly being in captivity, you have learned what? You might have learned Babylonian ways, but what was the point of the captivity? Learn your lesson. Right? Learn your lesson. Focus on God. Serve him. Don't serve these foreign nations. Don't let this sin creep into your midst. Focus on God and serve him. Ostensibly, they should have learned their lesson, and so what happens now? They're able to go home, except, Brother Roach, you kind of hinted at this, Who's going home? Who's going home? How many of them going home, Brother Roach? Very few, right. I wasn't going to ask you for a specific number. It's going to be in the area of 45,000. Yeah, in the area of 45,000 are going to be the ones who go back. Look at the very next verse there. I am trying to find something here. I'm sorry. The very next verse there. Verse 5. Somebody read verse 5 for us.
Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites arose, even everyone whose spirit God had stirred to go up and to rebuild the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem.
So, is everybody going to be going back? Are all the Jews going to be going back? What does verse 5 tell us? Who's going back? Okay, heads of the fathers' houses. People that lived there to begin with. People who remember being there.
Judah and Benjamin tribes.
Those of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. There's something else there. Whose hearts were stirred. Meaning there were some heads of households, there were some of Judah and Benjamin who what?
Were not in it.
Their hearts weren't in it, and they don't go. So I want you to think for just a minute. You have Israel as a united kingdom really at its precipice under the reign of Solomon. We have statements that we've seen back in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. It describes the nation at the time of Solomon, where gold and silver were as common as gravel on the road. Right? You just have fantastical wealth in the country at that time. You've got the kingdom dividing, and for a while it seems that at least the southern kingdom is going to continue to grow. Estimates put it at several 100,000, possibly up into the millions of people across the northern and the southern kingdom. You're skewing up towards the million number there. And so in chapter 2 of the book of Ezra, let's say you have 500,000 who go off into captivity. I think that might be a low number. But let's say you've got 500,000 who go off into captivity from the southern kingdom of Judah. How many are coming back? You start there in chapter 2. You look at verse 3 and you start to get these numbers, right? 2,172, 372, 775, 2,812. You go through and you add all of that up, and you're getting right around 47,000 people who are coming back. Just a small fraction of all of the people who had been taken captive by Babylon, and that doesn't include those who had been taken captive and taken away from the northern kingdom by the Assyrians. And so you go from this vast group of people down to 42,000, 47,000, 45,000. You think that would have been a stark difference for the people who were there? I mean, when you get into chapter 3, they're going to lay the foundation of the temple. Remember, the temple had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. They come in and they lay anew the foundation of the temple, and what happens? The young people do what? Look at Ezra chapter 3. Yeah, they do. They start to rebuild. At least they've got the foundation laid, and work is going to stop for a little while, but then they'll get going again. Yeah. In chapter 3, what do the young people do? The foundation of the temple is laid, and the people do what?
Feast of booths and celebrate the Feast of Booths.
They shout. They're excited.
Because
Who cries?
the glory of
The old men. The old men among them weep. And why do they weep? Why are they upset? Because they had seen the former temple in all of its glory, right? They are the ones who are keenly aware that what we had previously doesn't compare to what our present existence is. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, and now it's 40,000, 50,000. And then lay the foundation for this new temple. Does it look anything like the old temple? Not at all. But what's interesting is there's a promise in the Old Testament. What's the promise about this new temple? This foundation that's laid, what do the prophets say about the glory of this temple? Yeah, it's going to surpass in glory the original temple. Can you think of why that might be? Why would this second temple, I mean, it does not have the gold and the splendor that the original one did. Why then, how then could you say about this second temple that it's greater in glory than the first? Doesn't have foreign idols in it.
Well, the Son of God will actually walk in
There you go. I think that's the answer. Is that who is going to be presented in this temple? Jesus is. Who's going to preach in this temple? Who's going to interact in this? Jesus is. The very things that temple was looking forward to are going to be fulfilled within it by the one who was the focus of those prophecies. Something else going on here in Ezra I want you to take note of. In Ezra 1 and verse 1, the decree is from Cyrus. And he says in verse 2, for the Jews to return and to build what? Okay. Build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Okay? So the Jews are able to return to Jerusalem, and they are to rebuild the temple. Now, here's something interesting. I want you to come over to the book of Daniel real quick. Look at Daniel chapter 6. This is what I was looking for just a moment ago. Daniel chapter 6. Now, I know that this statement may place a little bit more confidence in our civil government than what might be appropriate. But let's say that our legislatures come up with a bill and they pass a bill. They pass a bill, but they realize they left out a word, right? That instead of saying you should not do something, they forgot the word not. And so they said you should do something. Should do something that you shouldn't do, okay? Now, if that happens, and if our government is functioning properly, what should happen? Yeah, you amend what's been passed, right? You fix it, right? We see that process play out with our Constitution, right? There are things that we wanted to change in our Constitution, and so we have a process to amend the Constitution, okay? But back here in Ezra's time, in the time of Zechariah, in the time of Daniel, it's not the U.S. government that's in charge. Who's in charge? The Medes and the Persians. And there's something unique about the Medes and the Persians and their law system. Look at Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6 and verse 8. Now, O king, establish the injunction. This is the orders against Daniel, right? Ordering Daniel not to pray. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed. Now, notice this. According to the laws of the Medes and Persians, which what? Which may not be revoked. One of the interesting things about the law system of the Medes and the Persians is that once a king signed a decree, that decree was signed. And there was no altering it, and there was no changing it. This, for example, explains what happens in the book of Esther. You know, the decree goes out. What's going to happen to the Jews at the end of the book? What's supposed to happen to them? They're supposed to be slaughtered. And we, with our English minds and our Western Civ courses, might think, hey, why didn't they just change the law? Why didn't they just write a law say, hey, that original law that was inspired by Haman, just 86 that. We're good. Jews can live. But that's not what happens. But now we understand why that couldn't happen in that law system. Because the laws of the Medes and the Persians do not change. You couldn't go back and undo something that had already been put in law. And so instead, what happens in the book of Esther is just exactly what should have happened under that law. Do you remember what happens at the end of Esther? The Jews can defend themselves. And that's how they got around that issue. They said, okay, the Jews can defend themselves. They have the right to protect themselves and defend themselves from those who would cause them harm. And indeed, they make it through. This will become an issue later in Ezra, in Nehemiah, on into Haggai and Zechariah, where you're going to have opponents who are trying to stop the Jews from doing what? From rebuilding what? The temple and the walls, right? And there seems to be, especially in Nehemiah, some pauses that take place. And then you do some searching of the archives. And they search the archives and they come all the way back and they find, Ezra chapter 1, what Cyrus had put into order. That the Jews had the right to go and rebuild the temple. And because that was put into order by a king under the laws of the Medes and the Persians, could that order be changed? Nope. And so the Jews were permitted to what? To continue the rebuild efforts, right? Even if you had a new king, and that's the important part there. This was just part of the empire's rules, right? If a king decreed it, it stuck. It stayed. The laws of the Medes and the Persians, Daniel 6, which do not change. Yes, Mike?
Was that because they viewed themselves as deity? And
I think that might be part of it.
never make mistakes.
I think,
We don't change
right.
anything.
I think that might be. I think that might be part of it there. All right. So we've got Ezra chapter 1. We've got the decree for the Jews to go home, right? Everyone whose heart is stirred, everyone who is among his people, you are free to go back. And we notice that it's only a paltry number, fewer than 50,000 that arrive back in this first migration. And this first migration is going to be led by two men, led by Zerubbabel, and led by, depending on the translation, you're reading from Jeshua or Joshua, same person there, okay? And both of these people referenced here in Ezra chapter 2. Ezra chapter 2. And it's under their guidance and under their leadership that the foundation of the temple is going to be laid. The book of Ezra, though, describes two different returns to Jerusalem. There's the first one that is led by Zerubbabel and Joshua. And there's going to be a second return led by whom? Led by Ezra. Right, there you go. And this is where the book gets its name. Here's Ezra. And what was Ezra? What was his occupation? What was his role? Scribe and a priest. That's right. So you've got Joshua and Zerubbabel that lead a return. You've got Ezra who leads a return. And who else leads a return? And he gets the whole book to himself. Nehemiah. That's right. Who's the shortest man in the Bible? Don't say Zacchaeus. Nehemiah. I'll be here all week. So we've got four individuals returning to, leading returns to Jerusalem: Joshua, Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. At the end of the book of Ezra, as Ezra starts his return and he comes into the land, what does he discover? What does he discover that really concerns him and bothers him? This is Ezra chapter 9. Yes, Steve? Okay, yeah, we've got a problem with the registry of the priests. That's one. Very good. Look at Ezra chapter 9. What's another problem here? Yeah, he comes into the land and he finds that the people have engaged in mixed marriages. And what had the law of Moses specifically stated? You were not supposed to intermarry with these pagan and foreign nations, and so you've got this problem here. And so you start in chapter 9 and chapter 10 going through and trying to remedy this situation. And so, whereas Joshua and Zerubbabel lead a return that's primarily focused on a physical rebuild, Ezra is going to lead a return that is primarily focused on what kind of rebuild? A spiritual one, right? Question number 3. Hadassah is the Hebrew name for what famous Old Testament character? See, here's another one, right? Here's another one like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We know them primarily by their pagan names and not by their given names. But her given name in Hebrew was Hadassah. We've mentioned Zerubbabel already. He leads this first return along with Joshua, coming back to Jerusalem to lay the foundation of the temple. Where else is Zerubbabel mentioned in the Old Testament? He's mentioned in Haggai and he's mentioned in Zechariah. So what does that do for our view of the Old Testament? That when the events of Ezra are transpiring, who's active at that time? Who are the prophets that are active at that time? Even though they're at the far end of our Old Testament, Haggai and Zechariah are active as prophets here in Ezra 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're involved and active. Flip over here with me to the book of Haggai. I'll give you an hour. Find the little book of Haggai. And look at Haggai chapter 1. Haggai 1 and verse 12, Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, and Joshua the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, with all the remnant of the people, obeyed the voice of the Lord their God and the words of Haggai the prophet as the Lord their God had sent him. And the people showed reverence for the Lord. Then Haggai, the messenger of the Lord, spoke by the commission of the Lord to the people, saying, I am with you, declares the Lord. So the Lord stirred the spirit of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and the spirit of all the remnant of the people, and they came and worked on the house of the Lord of hosts, their God, on the 24th day of the 6th month in the 2nd year of Darius the king. Goes to the beginning of Haggai chapter 1 is, why are you guys all dwelling in your nice houses while the temple of the Lord lies in disrepair? And so the focus was get up, rebuild the Lord's house, get to that work. Haggai is the one who is giving that prophecy and giving it to Zerubbabel and to Joshua. And so that kind of gives us a time frame for where all this is happening. Look at Zechariah chapter 4. A few pages over to your right. Look at Zechariah chapter 4. In Zechariah chapter 4, Zechariah is shown a vision. What do you see? This is chapter 4 and verse 2. Zechariah said, I see and behold a lampstand, all of gold, with its bowl on the top of it, and its 7 lamps on it, with 7 spouts belonging to each of the lamps which are on the top of it. Also 2 olive trees by it, one on the right of the bowl, the other on the left. Then I said to the angel who was speaking with me, saying, what are these, my Lord? So the angel who was speaking with me answered and said to me, do you not know what these are? And I said, no, my Lord. Then he said to me, this is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel. So again, here's our chronological context. Saying, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. What are you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel you will become a plain, and he will bring forth a top stone with shouts of grace, grace to it. Now, think about that. How many people have come back with Zerubbabel and Joshua? 50,000. A paltry 50,000 have returned. And yet God is trying to emphasize to Zerubbabel and Joshua that I am with you, and that if I am with you, you will prevail. And so he says to Zerubbabel, look, here's a great mountain in front of you, but by your might it's going to be what? A plain. Right? There is nothing that's going to what? There's nothing that's going to hinder you. I am with you. I will support you. I will see you through this. Also, the word of the Lord came to me. Oh, and don't forget there in verse 7, he will bring forth the top stone. Anyone's translation say anything other than top stone? Headstone? Anyone use capstone? Anything like that? Yeah, what is a top stone or a capstone? What is it? It's the final piece, right? It's that final piece. Picture like an arch, and you've got that final piece that you're slotting in the top there. That's the stone. That's the top stone. It's that last piece you're putting in. And so Zerubbabel is going to put what? He's going to put the top stone. What does that mean? He's going to finish it. The rebuilding of this temple is going to be accomplished, and it's going to be accomplished by Zerubbabel. All right? Look at verse 9. The hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house, and his hands will finish it. Then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. Now, what does that sound like? Does verse 9 sound like something to you? Buzzers and bells and lights should be going off in your head. What prophet does that sound like? Jeremiah. And who's our Old Testament prophet that throughout his book consistently said, then you will know, then you shall know? That's Ezekiel. This is the language from Ezekiel, then you shall know. Except in nearly all of those instances in Ezekiel, the then you shall know passages were all about what? Destruction and judgment and heartache. But now it's been reversed, hasn't it? You're going to see this temple completed in what? And then you will know that I am the Lord your God. God can make himself known in the bad. God can make himself known in the good. And these people had been through 70 years of the bad. And now they get a taste of the good. And I'm with you is God's emphasis here. I'm with you. I am strengthening you. And I will see you through. Verse 10, for who has despised the day of small things? What was small going? You probably heard a sermon preached on this before. But in the passage here, what were the small things? Yeah, the work on the temple. I mean, by this point, what have they done? They've laid a foundation. And then that kind of seems to be where things stop for a while. But little by little, they're doing the work. Little by little, it's going to be accomplished. So don't despise what? Don't despise little things. Don't despise the day of small things. But these 7 will be glad when they see the plumb line in the hands of Zerubbabel. What's a plumb line? This has nothing to do with sewers. Yes, a plumb line is a line that you would stretch to make sure that things are straight, right? Like a level that we would use today. So here's Zerubbabel. What's the picture? He's now doing what? He's measuring. The walls are up then, and we're measuring and making sure everything is level, everything is straight, right? So the temple is going to be rebuilt. It's going to be rebuilt under the leadership of Zerubbabel. Verse 5, question number 5. We get then into the book of Nehemiah. And who are going to be the primary, that to be the big focus in the book of Nehemiah is the people overcoming the challenges that are put against them. Who are the 3 main challengers to the work that God's people are doing in the book of Nehemiah? Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. That's right. Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 19 and Nehemiah chapter 6 verses 1 and 2 mentions all 3 of those people. All right, let's get into our thought questions here. And thought question number 1, why do you think so few Jews returned to Judah and Jerusalem? And hundreds of thousands are taken captive. And 50,000 go, not even 50,000. What are your thoughts, Jim?
For one thing, they settled in some very fertile land around Babylon. They had a pretty good life. group that came from Judah.
Yeah.
As far as the group that came from Samaria, it would be almost the same thing as China conquering Great Britain and the United States and telling all of us here in the United States we can go back to Great Britain. Because they'd been there over 100 years.
Right.
And they were pretty well settled in. I think the people were pretty well settled in and happy with their lives there. So they weren't ready to leave and go back to, frankly, nothing.
Very good. Anyone else? Kent.
And it's a 900-mile walk back to the sticks from the center of the world.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, right? You're not hopping on an airplane for that journey, are you? Travis?
I think human nature, most people don't like change.
Yeah.
Just, they don't like change. They didn't like going, but once they got there and they settled in, they didn't want to come back.
Yeah.
Human nature doesn't change that much.
They didn't want to go to Babylon, and then once they get there, they don't want to leave. Connie?
And also, the people who had been born there
Sure.
really knew nothing about Jerusalem and the old ways. And, why should they leave? They had their place here. It was just mainly the old.
And whose fault is that?
The old didn't tell them.
Older generation, that's right. Mitch?
I was going to say the same.
Same thing? All right, very good. Yeah, they seem to get comfortable over there in Babylon and Persia, wherever location they were in. They got comfortable. It seems like there was a failure amongst some of the older generation to talk about what was truly important. I mean, Israelite life in the Old Testament is built around what? The temple, right? That should have been something that people were focusing on and bringing people's mind and talking to their children about, right? Deuteronomy chapter 6. These laws, you were supposed to do what? Teach them to your children daily, right? When you rise up, when you lie down, when you're walking along the way. Yet it seems they come out here to Babylon for 70 years, and what happened? It seems a lot of that fell off. Sad that it fell off, because God has told them what? After 70 years, I'm going to bring you back. There should have been expectation. And for some people, there was expectation. Who do we know was eagerly expecting this return? Daniel was, because he's over there praying after he's read his Jeremiah scroll and figured it out. 70 years and we're going home. God help us be ready to go. And apparently there were some who were ready. Daniel, although we don't know that he ever went home, and I tend to think he wasn't able to. Joshua and Zerubbabel were ready to go, as were 45,000 others. That means there was a whole lot of people that weren't. Jim?
Interestingly enough, their descendants, at least until the Middle East wars recently, were still there. There was a rather good-sized settlement of Jewish people in Iraq.
Yes. Brother Roach?
Scripture also says God put it in their heart. Now, God knows our hearts.
Right.
And not all hearts were ready and willing to serve and work and
Right.
do that.
Right.
But that also shows how the providence God can work.
Sure. Very good.
When,
Mike?
when the Exodus from Egypt, all of Israel left, right? I mean, they were running for their lives because they were pursued, but it was kind of a refining that you see of a remnant of people that have, through generations.
God said, when you go into Babylon, I'm putting you through the refiner's fire. And what happens when you put metal into the fire? The dross burns off. And it turns out there was a lot more dross than there was precious metal.
Well, I just think it was kind of a testing of faith,
Yeah.
in families, generations.
Sure it is. Absolutely. Look at question number 2. Choose one of these characters and record why they are inspiring to you, and you cannot answer, they're not. So, Ezra, Esther, Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, or Joshua? Who'd you choose? Don't everybody speak at once, okay? Who you got? I'll give you mine. I'll start the conversation. I chose Joshua, the high priest. Look here in the book of Zechariah. Look at Zechariah 3. You've got this story here of Joshua. In chapter 3 and verse 1 of Zechariah, Zechariah has shown Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And the Lord said to Satan, "The Lord rebuke you, Satan. Indeed, the Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is this not a brand plucked from the fire?" There's our refining concept. Now Joshua was clothed with filthy garments and standing before the angel. Remember, this is a vision. But the picture is, here is Joshua standing before the angel of the Lord, and what does he look like? Ragged and tattered, dirty, right? And in verse 4, he spoke again to those who were standing before him, saying, "Remove the filthy garments from him." Again he said to him, "See, I have taken away your iniquity." What were those dirty garments all about? Sin. And now what's happened? Joshua's been forgiven. He's a forgiven leader who is now able to lead his people. "I have taken away your iniquity, and I will clothe you with festal robes." Now there's a big difference. I'm taking away your sin, and now I'm going to make you what? I'm going to make you glad. Give a cause for feasting and celebration. And of course, what's that going to be? The rebuilding of this temple, finishing the work that God had given them to do. "Put a clean turban on his head," verse 5. And so they put a clean turban on his head and clothed him with garments while the angel of the Lord was standing by. And the angel of the Lord admonished Joshua, saying, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, if you will walk in my ways, if you will perform my service, then you will also govern my house and also have charge of my courts. And I will grant you free access among these who are standing here." So here is Joshua going to lead the people. He had been, you get this picture. Here's a guy whose heart is in this. But here's a guy whose life has been marred by sin. And what is Satan trying to do? Yeah, keep him there. Right? He is in sin, and Satan's trying to keep him there. But what has God said about him? You're what? You're forgiven. And once God says to him, "You're forgiven," what does Satan have on him? Nothing. I think that's a beautiful picture there. Something that we need to buy into by faith, that once God tells us we are forgiven, what does Satan have against us? Nothing. This is a picture of what forgiveness actually is and what it looks like. Who is meaningful in these stories to you? Who did you pick out? Esther. Okay.
Figure out with the most tact she could come up with that the king had done a very poor job picking his number 2 man.
Not a fun conversation to have. That's why you invite him to dinner 3 or 4 times before saying it, right? All right, so Travis had Esther. Someone in the center aisle here, who you got? Be brave. You did your Bible lesson for today, right? What you got, Elise? Go for it. Everybody can't do Esther. No, it's okay. She wasn't afraid. It's a good one. Left side, right side, depending on how you're oriented. Who you got? You cannot say Esther.
Well, she was basically female,
Uh-huh.
which was looked down upon, and slave, which is looked down upon. And so she was like the lowest of the low position that came to a very high position, but she stayed humble. And
Very good. Good point. Are we allowed to like Mordecai in that same story? I like Mordecai. Who knows whether you've been brought into the kingdom for such a time as this? Question number 3. If Malachi serves as the chronological close of the Old Testament, and the Old Testament ends around 440 BC, chronologically speaking, who will be the next person that's focused on in the Bible? John the Baptist. John the Baptist, that's right. And how is that person referenced in the book of Malachi? There you go. He is called Elijah. And Jesus makes a point on that in Matthew chapter 17 and draws that application for us. And then question 4. Choose one of the following books and note how Jesus is referenced. Anyone choose Zechariah? How is Jesus referenced in Zechariah? Nobody chose Zechariah. Okay, I don't blame you. He's the branch. Question 4 is not on there? Well, I will have to speak to the editor of this workbook and get that fixed. Man, somebody dropped the ball. All right, well, let me just fill you in there. The last question was, go through some of these Old Testament books, choose whichever one you want, and notice how Jesus is referenced there. In the book of Zechariah, he is the branch. In the book of Malachi, he is the son of righteousness that Elijah comes before. And in the book of Esther, who's not mentioned? God's not mentioned. Jesus isn't mentioned by name. It's been said that while God's name is not mentioned, his fingerprints are all over the book. And certainly that seems to be the case. Thanks for your presence this morning. We'll pick up lesson 23 next week.